A while back, I was at lunch with a couple friends of mine. One of them had just received bad news, and so we were commiserating with him, talking about what had happened and what the next steps would be, and just trying to be supportive friends. And there was a lull in the conversation, and my one friend says to the other, "Well, everything happens for a reason." And right away, and I'm not proud of this, but right away I said, "You know that's not in the Bible, don't you?" So I'm that guy now. I was trying to be funny. I don't think I came off as funny. He knew I was working on this project, so he knew what I was talking about. And he never really claimed that it came from the Bible, but it did give us an opportunity to talk about whether that phrase is helpful or not. Everything happens for a reason. It's one of the most persistent and popular Christianisms out there. We've all heard it. We've probably all said it. Somebody gets some bad news, you want to encourage them in some way. It comes in many forms. God has a plan. You know, when God closes a door, he always opens a window. Won't it be great to see how God works all this out? There's some biblical truth there. And we believe that Jesus is the King of the universe, so we believe that there's nothing that happens that's outside of his control. There's nothing that happens that God can't use for his good purposes, for his glory, for our ultimate good. So, in a sense, there is a reason behind everything that happens. But I think this cliche and the way we tend to use it most often is misleading. And it can lead to some ideas that can do some great spiritual harm. I'm going to change my questions up a little today. Instead of starting with where's the biblical truth, I want to ask, what is it that we're saying when we use this phrase? What are we really telling somebody when we say to them, everything happens for a reason? And I want to suggest to you that when we say everything happens for a reason, what we're really saying is everything bad happens for a good reason. Right? Somebody has something bad happen to them, and so we say, well, surely there's a reason, and it must be a good reason that this has happened, which is really only a short step from saying, you know this bad thing that happened to you? Well, actually, it's a good thing. Or to use another Christianism, it's a blessing in disguise. And you say, well, Russell, when I use the phrase, that's not what I mean. What I mean is that God's in control, and so that even in these bad things, God can still work things for the good. I would never call a bad thing a good thing, and I know that's not what you're trying to say, but it is what you're communicating. And here's how I know it. I know that because we never use this phrase to talk about good things. I mean, think about it. Somebody comes to you with good news. You would never say to them, well, everything happens for a reason. Imagine somebody comes to you and tell you, oh, I just got a scholarship to my dream school. And you go, oh, yeah, well, everything happens for a reason. If you'd say that, they'd be terrified, petrified. They'd say, what do you mean everything happens for a reason? Don't you think my scholarship's a good thing? It's a phrase we only use in reference to bad things. And when we do, when something bad happens to somebody, we say, well, everything happens for a reason. Well, what we're implying is that reason must be good, right? We're trying to encourage our friend. We want them to be hopeful in the midst of their suffering. So surely there must be a good reason behind the suffering they're enduring. And because we're Christians, that means, this must be part of God's plan. And so what we say as Christians when we say everything happens for a reason is we're saying God allows everything to happen for his good reasons. Or God has caused this thing to happen in your life. So now let's talk about where's the spiritual harm. How does this phrase lead us in misleading directions? I've got 3 things. For one thing, it can lead to God blaming. As I just demonstrated, when we use the phrase as Christians, everything happens for a reason, we're really saying that God has caused these things to happen in our lives. And that can be comforting if you believe God is good and you believe God has your best interest in mind, but can also make you bitter and angry with God. well, if God is causing this thing to happen in my life, well, I'm not so sure I'm happy with God. If everything happens for a reason, then God's at fault for messing with my life, and maybe I'll just be done with him. I think the problem is that we confuse what God allows with what God causes. If God permits something, we make the assumption that he must prefer it. And so if he permits something to happen, we conclude he must have planned it, which means God has designed these bad things that happen in our lives. And yet the Bible tells us God does not plan evil, and in God there is no darkness at all. So we need to stop short of making God the author of evil. Just because he allows something doesn't mean he planned it. And while he can redeem things, that doesn't mean he's to blame for them. Our second problem is it can lead to what I call silver lining searching. If everything happens for a reason, then what do? Well, we want to know what's the reason. If a black cloud comes our way, we're busy looking for the silver lining behind it. And that can lead to some really gross ideas. For example, you've probably heard of murderers who've given their lives to Jesus after they've been in prison. And so we might say, well, at least something good came out of all of that, right? At least now this person's walking with Jesus. And I want to say, really? Do you think that it was necessary for this person to kill somebody in order for God to lead them into a relationship with his son? I mean, God's all kinds of forgiving, and God can and does forgive the vilest of sinners, even murderers. But don't think for a moment that God designs for someone to be a murder victim so that his or her killer can come to have a saving relationship with Jesus. We can say a lot of dumb things when we start thinking everything happens for a reason. Isaiah 5 verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." So if you've ever thought that, there must be a good purpose behind cancer or the death of a child or a corporate scandal that leaves hundreds of people unemployed, well, just don't. Those things aren't good things, and it's wrong to call them good. The third problem is it leads to what I call misplaced hope. When we're looking for the silver lining behind everything that happens, we begin to place our hope in some sort of explanation or resolution to the suffering we're experiencing. So if we're fighting a disease, we look for the resolution of the cancer. If we have relationship problems, we're holding on to hope for that one relationship that's going to make all the previous heartache worthwhile. As Christians, we believe that a day is coming when there will be no more crying or sickness or pain in heaven. In heaven. But meanwhile, here on earth, we're not promised explanations for everything that happens to us. And so it's better to place our hope in Jesus than the wishful thinking that someday, suddenly, all of our suffering is just going to make sense. So now let's add another question. If we can't say that God is the author of every bad thing that happens, can we ask, why do bad things happen? Now, that's a big topic. I could preach every Sunday morning for the next 5 years on this topic, and we'd probably still not have a fully satisfying answer. But here, in a nutshell, let me give you 3 reasons that bad things happen. One is because we live in a fallen world. Ever since Adam and Eve sinned, the world has been stuck in corruption and being held hostage by the fallen nature of the world in which we live. Romans 8:20 and 21 says it like this: "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." Frustration and bondage and decay. The world in which we live is not the perfect world which God first created. That means that sometimes cells in your body can go from being helpful servants to your well-being to cancerous traitors that are bent on your own destruction. That means that some of the natural laws that we count on to be consistent and predictable sometimes work to our disadvantage. Like the low pressure front that brings much needed rain to the crops in the Midwest, sometimes starting as a hurricane in the Gulf that brings great destruction to the coast. Quite simply, our world is broken. It does not work as it should. But more than that, we deal with fallen people. Sin is a universal condition, and that means everyone you meet is a sinner, and that means some of the sins that they commit are going to affect other people. Think of the worst things that people can do to one another. Child abuse, racial discrimination, rape, or human trafficking, or mass shootings. These things happen not because God has a good reason, but because sinners are sinning against one another. Of course, it's not just the really bad things or the really bad people. Everybody you deal with is a sinner, which means even your own family and friends are going to commit sins that are going to sometimes hurt you. Sometimes your friends will betray you. Sometimes your boss will lie to you. Sometimes your own spouse is going to lose his or her temper and say something mean to you. Bad things happen because we live in a fallen world and we deal with fallen people. But more than that, we have fallen natures. Let's face it, the bad things aren't just out there. The bad stuff is in here. And a lot of the bad things that we experience are the result of our own bad choices. And so if you fail out of school because you never bothered to go to class or study for a test, you shouldn't ask why God is letting this happen to you. If you end up in jail because you've been bouncing checks and skipping out on your creditors, you shouldn't ponder for too long, why this has happened. Sometimes the chickens come home to roost. We live in a fallen world. We deal with fallen people. We ourselves are fallen. So now let's go to our final question. Is there better news in the gospel? Does the Bible have better news? And of course, it does. I need to say at this point that I believe in the sovereignty and the providence of God. My picture of God is of a God who's never out of control in this world. Words like sovereignty and providence are very important to me. That means I don't believe in luck. I don't believe in fate. I don't believe in chance. I don't believe anything has ever happened that was beyond God's ability to change or foresee. I often explain this by saying I don't believe God can be surprised. There's not a single thing that's happened to me, a good thing, a bad thing, or anything in between, where God has looked down and said, I can't believe that happened to Russell. I didn't see that coming. I don't believe that happens. But now it sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. I'm telling you that God is not the planner or the author of the bad things that happen to you, but at the same time, I'm telling you that nothing happens to you that God could not foresee or change if he wanted to. Again, we're dealing with the mystery of what it means to be God here. But I believe the Bible teaches both things, and I believe both things are true. God is not the author of evil, but God cannot be surprised. Which leads me to Romans 8:28. This is the verse people most often think of when they talk about this idea that everything happens for a reason. In fact, a lot of people think that cliche is taught in this verse. It says this: we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. This is a great promise. This is a precious promise, one of the most precious promises in Scripture. It's a verse to hold on to when you are encountering difficult times. Let's talk for a moment about what this verse is not saying. For one thing, this verse is not for everyone. It's very specific. This verse is talking about those who love God and who've been called according to his purpose. That leaves out a lot of people. It leaves out a lot of things that happen. Also, I want you to notice that this verse does not say that everything that happens is good or that everything that happens for a good reason. Rather, what this promises is that God can work for the good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose, no matter what happens. So really the strength and the beauty of this promise is not that God can someday make it so all things turn out to be good things, but that no matter what happens, God's ultimate purposes, his eternal plan for us, our ultimate good, will never be foiled. God is able to restore, renew, and redeem the things that happen in our world. You know, I first preached on this cliche several years ago, and I ended the sermon by using these three words: restore, renew, redeem. And I urged the congregation, instead of giving into the temptation to try to divine the purpose for everything that was happening to them, to just rest in the hope that no matter what was happening, even the worst things, God could restore, redeem, and renew. And then more recently, some bad things happened in my life. And as I was working through those struggles, someone who'd been in the congregation for that first sermon wrote me a note. She's a college student. And part of her note, she said this. She said, "I'm not going to say that everything happens for a reason. I still remember that sermon from 3 years ago. The words restore, renew, and redeem are written inside the cover of my Bible from that sermon. I know God will restore, renew, and redeem in this situation." It was jolting to hear my own words spoken back to me like that, and to be reminded that I didn't need to look for the reason these bad things were happening, but I could rest in the hope that God could restore and renew even in the midst of it. As Christians, we don't believe that there's a good reason behind everything that happens, but we do believe that our good God can redeem the bad things for his good purposes.